Well, good evening, Tweeddale. This is the Star of Bethlehem. What we're going to do is to have a look at the Gospel of St. Matthew, look at the account of the Star of Bethlehem, the star in the east that prompted the Magi to travel to Bethlehem. We're going to look at astronomical candidates and ask ourselves, what might the Star of Bethlehem have been? If we're trying to match up the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew, which candidates actually match the account? How well do they fit? And then we'll have a look at the dates and ask ourselves what happened when in terms of activity in the sky, in the night sky, and do any particular known events fit the timeline of the Nativity? I'll then use a piece of software called Starry Night, and we'll wind the clock back 2,000 years and actually have a look at what the sky might have looked like. And then I will summarize right at the end. So let's remind ourselves what is in Matthew's account, the principal elements, the principal factors that we're trying to account for in the Star of Bethlehem. The Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. They didn't follow a star in the east. A star appeared in the east and that prompted them to travel west. So the Bible doesn't talk about them following a star. It talks about being prompted on their journey by the appearance of a star in the east. When they got to Jerusalem, they asked Herod, "What's this we hear about the birth of a new king, the king of the Jews?" But Herod didn't really understand what it was they were talking about. He was unaware of the birth of a new king. The Magi travelled on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky and then stopped over Bethlehem. So in red there, those 5 elements are the key elements that we would like to match up to a possible astronomical candidate. A star that appears in the east, it signifies the birth of the King of the Jews. Herod, for some reason, was not aware of that particular interpretation, and then the star reappeared and finally stopped. If we can find a candidate that matches all 5 of those points, maybe we found the Star of Bethlehem. Firstly, let's just remind ourselves about the popular Christmas carol. Well, that's enough of that. We three kings of Orient are. When we're looking at the lyrics of this particular Christmas carol, we should remind ourselves that the Bible doesn't actually talk about 3 wise men or 3 magi. It's only assumed that there were 3 of them because the Bible refers to 3 gifts, gold, frankincense and myrrh. And if there were 3 gifts, it's just assumed that there were 3 visitors, 3 magi, 3 wise men. But it doesn't actually give a number. Maybe there were actually 20 of them. 3 bought gifts and the other 17 just didn't get the memo. So that's just an assumption. So really, as I'm a physicist and I like precision, we really should not talk about we 3 kings. So let's get rid of the 3. And where did kings come from? The Bible doesn't mention kings. The Bible refers to magi, and the closest translation of that is wise men. And as far as I know, the original gender does indicate that they were men rather than women. But they weren't kings, so we ought to take that out of the Christmas carol as well. And where did these people come from? Well, we don't know. They came from somewhere east of Jerusalem. It might have been Persia, it might have been India, it might have been Mongolia, it might have been the Orient. But the Bible doesn't actually say, so we ought to take out the geography as well. And as I've just said, they saw a star in the east. They didn't follow a star in the east, but they did see one which prompted them to head west. So we shouldn't really talk about following yonder star either. So you see, this Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. And as a physicist, as I like precision, I really ought to change the lyrics of We 3 Kings to something more exact. So more precise is, we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are, who saw a star. Now, I agree it doesn't meter quite as well as the original We Three Kings, but at least it is more precise. But you can see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. And whenever we talk about the three wise men, we should remember that it isn't strictly three wise men, it is n wise men, where n is a number between 1 and infinity. It is plural, so it is more than one, but we don't know how many. Do we get any inkling of what a star could be? We have to bear in mind that a star doesn't mean a star in the sense that we understand it astronomically today. Astrophysics tells us what a star is, a shining body, a whole load of gas, usually fusing hydrogen into helium or helium into heavier elements, but that's not what star means in the context of the Star of Bethlehem. It's a lot more general because as well as the fixed stars in the sky, of course the stars will appear to move as the night progresses because of the rotation of the Earth, but stars will be in a fixed pattern relative to each other, forming the patterns of constellations. But in addition to the fixed stars, there are other stars to be seen in the sky. For instance, those stars that move relative to the fixed stars, the wandering stars that we now understand as planets. And some stars do not appear to be pinpoint pins of light, but have attachments. They might have a tail, or they might appear hairy, or they might be broom stars as they're sometimes called. So rather than pinpoints of light, we could have hairy stars, which we would today understand as comets. Icy bodies where the ice evaporates as the comet approaches the sun and forms the distinctive tail. And of course, one aspect of a star that is still in common usage is a shooting star, which we would often call meteors, but still shooting star is a phrase that's often used even today. And a meteor coming into the atmosphere might appear at night time to be a very bright object. So we have wandering stars, hairy stars, shooting stars. So we must remember that star could be a very broad definition. As far as the Star of Bethlehem is concerned, a star means something seen in the night sky, other than presumably the moon, which would be described as the moon. Do we get any clues about what the Star of Bethlehem might have been from any, for instance, paintings that have occurred in the last few centuries? If we look back at artwork of the Adoration of the Magi, we find that's been depicted many times. In all cases, there are 3 Magi coming to pay homage to the new baby Jesus. Again, it's 3, not because there were 3, but because everybody expects there to be 3. And in many of these depictions of the Adoration of the Magi, in the background there we see the Star of Bethlehem, in this case a pinpoint of light shining down onto the baby Jesus. In this version by Botticelli, it's widely believed that this on the right-hand side is Botticelli himself, photobombing his own painting effectively. There's the Star of Bethlehem, presumably in the background. There's Joseph looking very bored. He doesn't seem to be taking any part in the celebration here. Perhaps that's appropriate because allegedly he didn't take any part in the conception either. So maybe. If we look at various other depictions, again, there's the Star of Bethlehem in the background. Giotto is one of the few painters who actually has indicated that the Star of Bethlehem might have been a comet. Clearly, in this case, it is not a star beaming down onto Jesus. Here, the tail is going off in the top left direction and clearly indicates something that's more like a comet than a star as we would understand it. Various other depictions, Rubens here, I actually struggle to find any depiction of the Star of Bethlehem in the background, which is quite unusual for a painting of the Adoration of the Magi. So instead of a star in the background, we appear to have a two-headed camel. I don't know what that is doing there. In other situations, again, it looks like just a pinpoint star shining down onto Jesus. Again, Van Lint, a pinpoint star shining down. It's no surprise that paintings that, of course, were painted many centuries after the Nativity, it's no surprise that these don't really give us any clue as to what the Star of Bethlehem actually was. We don't expect these paintings to be documentary accounts of what actually happened. So what about the astrological significance of objects that appear in the sky? Well, every planet and every bright star, every zodiacal constellation through which the planets and the sun and the moon moved throughout the course of a year, all of these objects had an astrological significance. For instance, Venus, the brightest planet, usually seen fairly close to the sun, because of its magnitude, because of its brightness, was often associated with beauty and also fertility and also birth. Jupiter, also a very bright planet that can get almost as bright as Venus. But of course, Jupiter can be seen even in the middle of the night, whereas Venus tends to be seen at dusk or dawn because it can't stray too far from the sun. Because Jupiter is a very bright planet, it's often associated with royalty and is thought of by many cultures as being the king of planets. And whilst we're talking about kings, the star Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, the name Regulus is Latin for little king, and Regulus is often considered to be the king of stars. The brightest star in the constellation of Leo, where Leo itself is often associated with the Lion of Judea, because the tribe of Judea and the land of Judea are depicted by a flag which has a lion on it, and therefore Leo, the lion in the sky, is often associated with the Lion of Judea. So why attach astrological significance to objects in the night sky? Well, it was assumed that if you look at the night sky and look at how things change, you get an idea of what God has in store for mankind. Are we going to have a good harvest? Are we going to have a famine? Are we going to have a flood? Is a war coming? God will tell us what we have in store if we watch the sky and if we interpret it correctly. We can think of the sky as being God's Facebook page. That's where he's going to post anything interesting that's going to happen. So if we want to know the future, we keep an eye on the sky. That's the idea of astrology. So what are the star candidates? We're going to look at a few astronomical candidates, and in each case we're going to ask ourselves, could that candidate be considered a star in the east? Could it have been considered significant? Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said star? Is there a reasonable explanation for that? Could the star reappear in the sky, and could the star stop in the sky? These are the 5 elements of the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew. So let's have a look at a few candidates. Could the Star of Bethlehem be a shooting star, a meteor? Well, as we know, meteors will flash all over the sky during a meteor shower, so why would you talk about a star in the east when the meteors would be all over the sky? So that doesn't seem to make sense. Could it have been significant? Well, meteors, we know, occur in showers that occur multiple times during the year, and usually year after year after year. So why would something that occurs so regularly be considered a significant sight? And of course, if it isn't significant, there's no surprise that Herod wasn't aware of what they were talking about if we're trying to explain the Star of Bethlehem with a shooting star. Could the star have reappeared in the sky? Well, meteor showers come and go. You might get a night with a lot of meteors and then they fade away. And then later in the year, perhaps weeks, perhaps months later, you could get meteors reappearing again. So yes, they could reappear in the sky. Could a meteor stop in the sky? Well, it doesn't seem very clear as to what you would mean by a meteor stopping in the sky. They'll be flashing all over the sky during the course of a night. So shooting stars don't seem to fit the account. What about a comet? Could a comet appear in the east? Well, yes, a comet, which would be probably falling in from perhaps the Oort cloud, which is a spherical cloud around the solar system. Comets can fall into the inner solar system from essentially any direction. So yes, a comet could be seen in the east. Would it have been significant? Well, a bright comet with a large, bright, long tail would definitely have been considered significant. But if it was that bright and that significant, why wasn't Herod aware of what they were talking about when they talk about a sign in the sky that heralds the birth of a new king? Could a comet reappear in the sky? Well, as comets go around the sun, it's possible that the comet could go behind the sun as seen from the Earth, and so it would temporarily disappear from view, and then a little while later it could reappear in the sky again. So yes, a comet can reappear. Could a comet stop in the sky? Well, generally speaking, comets are in orbits which are not aligned with the planets in the solar system, and even if you take into account that the Earth is moving and the comet is moving, it doesn't seem very likely that a comet could stop in the sky. What about other candidates? Could it have been a nova? Could it have been a new star? Strictly not a new star, but a star that suddenly brightened such that it was invisible to start with and then brightened by a factor of perhaps hundreds or even thousands of times and then became bright in the night sky. Well, could that appear in the east? Quite definitely. It could appear in principle anywhere in the sky. Could it have been significant? Well, if it was bright enough, it would definitely be considered a significant new appearance in the sky. But if it was bright, why wouldn't Herod be aware of it? Again, we come back to that problem. And can you think of how a star can reappear in the sky if the star is a nova? Well, yes, nova are often recurrent. They can brighten quite considerably and then fade away, and it is possible for that star to brighten again later. But usually years or decades or hundreds of years later, not usually a few weeks or a few months after it first brightened. So it doesn't seem likely that a nova could reappear in the sky. And if it is a nova, which is effectively a fixed star, simply one that became rather bright, why would you talk about a star stopping in the sky? Because a nova would be fixed relative to all of the other fixed stars in the constellations. So why would you talk about a fixed star stopping in the sky? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And similar arguments apply for a supernova. Could a supernova appear in the east? Definitely. Would it be significant? Well, if it was a bright supernova, even a very distant supernova might appear quite bright. Yes, that could be considered quite significant. But again, if it was a very bright light in the sky, then how come Herod wouldn't be aware of this new sign? And generally speaking, because a supernova is a star coming to the end of its life and effectively blowing itself to pieces, quite often stars do not do that twice. Once they come to the end of their life and go supernova, that is it. A star doesn't go supernova twice, a few months apart. And again, for the same argument as the nova, a supernova would be a particular point in the sky relative to the other fixed stars. So why would you talk about the star stopping in the sky? So these four candidates don't seem to match all five of the criteria we're trying to deal with. But the fifth candidate does seem to fit. A conjunction of planets. And here I'm using the astrological symbol for conjunction, this dumbbell symbol. Could a conjunction of planets occur in the east? Well, because each planet, as we'll see shortly, is going around the sun at a different speed, conjunctions can occur at various parts in the sky, and definitely they could occur in the east. Depending on which planets we're talking about, it could be considered very significant. Depends on how bright the planets are and how close they get in the sky. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of a conjunction of planets? Well, it might be that he was aware of the conjunction of planets, but didn't necessarily apply the same significance, the same astrological significance, as the Magi might have done when they saw a particular conjunction of planets in a particular part of the sky. Herod probably didn't have very good eyesight, but he would have had a court of astrologers advising him of what was going on in the sky. Could a conjunction reappear in the sky? Yes, because of the motion of planets, which we'll see shortly, it is possible for a conjunction of two planets to reoccur sometime after an initial conjunction. And could a planet stop in the sky? It quite definitely can, for a reason we're about to look at. So because we are going to investigate a little more of the idea of conjunctions, let's just make sure we understand about planetary motion. So if we have two hypothetical planets, one closer to the sun, the green planet is closer to the sun, so it experiences a stronger gravitational force, so it moves more quickly around the sun. And from any particular vantage point in the solar system, these two planets might appear to be in the same part of the sky or might appear to be in different parts of the sky. Even when they do appear to be in the same part of the sky, generally speaking, two planets don't get particularly close to each other simply because they are not, as this two-dimensional representation would imply, they are not necessarily orbiting in the same plane. Planets tend to have tilted orbits, and so as they cross each other in the sky, one planet will go slightly north or south of the other. In much the same way that the moon goes around the Earth once a month, but that doesn't mean that the moon is going to cover the sun once a month and give us a total eclipse of the sun. Because the moon's orbit is tilted, so when the moon and the sun cross in the sky, usually the moon goes above or below to the north or to the south of the sun rather than actually cover the disk of the sun. Same idea with planets. The second idea, which is important in what's to follow, is the fact that if we remind ourselves that the inner planets go a lot faster than the outer planets, it's possible for the inner planet to overtake, or undertake if you like, go faster than the outer planet on the inside lane. And just like when you have a whole load of cars going down a motorway, if one car is going quite fast, the other cars might appear to be going backwards. They're all travelling in the same direction, but if you're travelling fast, the other cars might appear to be going backwards. And the same is true of planets. If we imagine that green is the Earth and red is one of the outer planets, Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, then because every once in a while the Earth is going to overtake on the inside lane and go faster than the outer planet, then the usual west to east motion can be reversed, so-called retrograde motion. So on the right-hand side, there's a little cartoon of what the outer planet might appear to do on the sky. It might move from west to east for quite a while, but then stop in the sky, and then move backwards and stop in the sky a second time, and then continue with its west to east motion. Let's just see that little animation once again. Normally moving west to east, but every once in a while it'll appear to stop in the sky, move backwards, stop again, and then continue moving forwards. Not because the outer planet is doing anything peculiar, but just because the Earth is overtaking it on the inside lane. Retrograde planetary motion, which we'll see shortly. So let's think first about the timeline. I've shown a few years BC here because we think Christ was born a few years BC. One thing to note is that if you do want to use some simulation or planetarium software to see what was going on, to see what the sky looked like a few years BC, be careful to make sure that your particular app of choice, your software of choice, does not incorrectly insert a year 0 in between 1 AD and 1 BC. I've seen that happen, and so just whichever software you use as your favourite software, check it doesn't introduce a 0 before you start trying to line up events a few years BC. So we think Christ was born either between 8 and 4 BC or possibly between 3 and 1 BC. I'm not too sure exactly why people do not believe that he was born between 3 and 4 BC. And I am no biblical scholar, so I'm relying on the considerations of other people. But the idea of Christ being born in the period of between 8 and 4 BC is predicated on the idea that Herod died in 4 BC and Christ was born before Herod died. But it is believed by some people that Herod actually died in 1 BC rather than 4 BC. It depends on how you date things from this period, because we don't have definitive dates from a few years BC. We know that people lived and died according to, did they die after this eclipse, which occurred the year after this famine or this flood? Events dictate which year we're talking about. And some people believe that a particular eclipse dates Herod's death as 4 BC, but other people believe, no, it's the wrong eclipse people are looking at. You should look at a later eclipse, and that would put Herod's death at 1 BC. And of course, that gives you two windows, as it were, to think about astronomical events. So, were there any comets around that might have fit the bill? Well, there was a comet around in 12 BC, that was Halley's Comet. and it probably would have been quite bright because the various passages of Halley past the Sun that we've seen recently have been quite bright, so it was probable that Halley's comet was quite bright in 12 BC. But why would God post something on his Facebook page many years before the birth of Christ? That doesn't seem to fit. There were other comets visible. In 5 BC there was Comet Holmes. Perhaps some of you remember that from a few years back when it passed the Earth and its coma expanded quite dramatically as it passed the Sun. But that, we think, would be too faint to be a very spectacular object back in 5 BC. The other comet in 4 BC was Churyumov-Gerasimenko, in other words, the Rosetta comet, the comet that was visited by Rosetta and then a little lander Philae went down to the surface. An interesting comet, but quite a tiny one compared, for instance, to Halley. So it's unlikely that that particular comet would have been a spectacular sight. What about other objects? Nova. Well, a bright nova might come along every few hundred years. But it appears that two came along at once, like buses. The Chinese saw one in 5 BC, and the Koreans saw one and documented it in 4 BC. But that doesn't seem very likely that the Chinese saw one and the Koreans didn't, and the Koreans saw one and the Chinese didn't. So this is probably a sign that we've got our dating slightly wrong, and in fact that was not two nova appearing. It was one nova that's been either misrecorded or simply we've got the months wrong, and it was in late 5 BC or early 4 BC. But for the reasons we went through earlier, a nova doesn't seem to fit the bill, even though there was one that was visible at about the right time. But what about conjunctions? This is where it starts getting interesting. So here again, I've used the astrological symbol, a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. There's the reminder of what the symbols mean in the bottom left there. There was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, just like the one we saw a couple of years ago in December 2020. That conjunction would have occurred around 6 BC, and some people believe that to be the origin of the idea of the Star of Bethlehem. But I think it's much more interesting to have a look at this other conjunction that occurred around 2 BC. And of course, this can only be a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem if Herod died in 1 BC, otherwise it would have occurred after Herod's death and presumably be too late to be a herald of the birth of Jesus. Now, this particular conjunction that I'm highlighting here is very interesting for a reason which we'll see if we use the Starry Night software to dial the clock back 2,000 years and see what it looked like in the sky. So I'm using this software just to look in the constellation of Leo because that's where all the action is. So I'm not showing day and night, I'm not showing where the horizon is, and I'm not labeling everything in the field of view because it just gets too confusing when we start running a time lapse. I've got the time set to, in this case at the moment, the 1st of August in 3 BC at about tea time. And I don't know where we should be looking from. I don't know whether we should be looking from Persia or India or Mongolia or the Far East. So in order to take any geography out of the equation, I've asked this planetarium software to show me what's going on as seen from the centre of the Earth. So obviously we could be off by a vantage point of a few thousand miles. Is that going to make a difference when we're looking at planets and stars? Well, presumably a few thousand miles doesn't make that much difference. So what we're going to do is run the clock forward and we'll see Jupiter moving from west to east. In other words, from right to left in this particular chunk of sky. You can see there's Leo with the familiar sickle, there's Regulus, there's the rest of the constellation of Leo, and over on the right we have Cancer and Gemini, and over on the left we have the constellation of Virgo. So let's run the clock forward from August 3 BC and see what happens to Jupiter as it moves through the sky, and Venus, which I haven't labelled, but that's it there, coming behind. And remember, Venus is going to move in the sky faster than Jupiter. So as we move through August, we see that Venus gets very close to Jupiter. What do we mean by very close? Well, a fraction of a degree. These two very bright objects, Venus would be about magnitude -4, Jupiter about magnitude -3, I think. They would have been very close in the sky. Unlike the conjunction we saw of Jupiter and Saturn, where Saturn was significantly fainter than Jupiter, here we have two very bright planets getting very close, less than the diameter of the full moon. When did this happen? It happened in August of 3 BC, and it would have happened and been visible in the morning. This would have been a star in the east. It would have been visible for about an hour before sunrise. So two very bright points of light in the sky would have got very close together, and it would have been quite a dramatic sight in the east just before sunrise. So perhaps this is the origin of the star in the east. Now let's wind the clock forward a little while and think about what the astrologers would have made of this. Remember that the astrological significance may well have been, this is speculation, but it may well have been, if we're seeing a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Leo, the land of Judea, or the tribe of Judea. So Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in Leo might have been interpreted as, this is interesting, birth of the King of the Jews. Let's keep an eye on the sky and see what happens next, say the astrologers. Venus goes off to the left from west to east. Jupiter then passes Regulus. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars over a few months after the original conjunction. And as we go into November, look at what's happening to Jupiter. Jupiter has now stopped in the sky. The clock is still moving forward, but Jupiter has stopped in the sky and is now moving backwards, retrograde motion. And as it goes backwards, Jupiter passes Regulus again. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars a second time. And as we go into spring of 2 BC, Jupiter stops in the sky again, and then continues to move forward and moves forward past Regulus a third time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the course of a few months after the original conjunction. Very interesting, say the astrologers. This is something to do with kings. This is to do with kings doing a little dance. Maybe one king is passing the crown over to another king. Definitely worth keeping an eye on the sky and seeing what happens next. Jupiter will continue in its traverse from west to east, but now Venus is back again. Venus, remember, goes round the sun rather quickly compared to Jupiter, and Venus has been round the sun and has come back again, and there's Venus about to move from west to east. Let's run a little bit further forward into June of 2 BC. Now Venus and Jupiter are in conjunction a second time on June the 18th of 2 BC. And this one, unlike the last one, is a very, very close conjunction. Not simply a fraction of a degree, which most people with acute eyesight could easily make out as 2 points of light. Here, the planets are extremely close together. So close, I'll have to zoom in to show you. So let's just center up Jupiter into the middle of the field of view and zoom in so you can see exactly how close Jupiter and Venus were in the sky. Now in this planetarium software, Venus is shown as the surface of Venus, not the blindingly white cloud tops that of course we would see. But notice that in this particular field of view, the planets are closer together than 1 arc minute. I don't think any human alive could possibly distinguish these 2 planets as 2 independent points of light. Over the course of a few nights, Jupiter and Venus would have come together and at one point would have merged into one very bright point of light that could not be distinguished as 2 objects. And again, this occurred in the constellation of Leo. So Venus and Jupiter again in a very dramatic conjunction in the constellation of Leo. Birth, king, Jews. A conjunction this close, I don't think occurs very often in 1,000 years. I don't think any of the astrologers alive at the time would ever have seen anything quite like this before. So maybe this was the sign that tells them it is worth going to the land of Judea and paying homage to the new king. So let me just recap what the timeline might have been for whatever the Magi saw. In August of 3 BC, there was a close conjunction, close meaning a fraction of a degree, closer than the diameter of the full moon, but still 2 points of light. Venus and Jupiter in Leo could have been interpreted as birth, king, Jew. Over the next few months, the king of stars and the king of planets got very close. The king of planets passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the coming months. There is something about one king passing over to another king. And if we continue into the spring of the following year, the 2 planets are in conjunction again, Venus and Jupiter, in a conjunction so close they would have merged into 1 point of light. Maybe that was the starting pistol that told the Magi, go to the land of Judea and pay homage to the new king of the Jews. How long would it have taken them to get there? Well, we have no idea. We don't know where they came from, and we don't know how they travelled. Maybe they walked, maybe they rode camels. If you believe the Christmas cards, they rode camels. But Christmas cards are not good documentary evidence for what actually happened. But it's interesting to note that Jupiter, a little later than the summer of 2 BC, does indeed stop in the sky 1 more time. It happens a few months later. So is it possible that the Magi started their journey towards Jerusalem in the summer, but didn't make their arrival in Bethlehem until perhaps some months later? When does Jupiter actually stop in the sky in 2 BC? Jupiter stops in the sky on the 25th of December. Yes, of course, just a coincidence. The Christians took over that particular date from an old pagan festival to celebrate the ending of the midwinter, the passing of the longest night. But maybe, who knows, speculation, that's when the Magi supposedly arrived at Bethlehem. So maybe this pair of conjunctions and this conjunction of Jupiter with the star Regulus account for the Star of Bethlehem. Maybe it was these conjunctions that were passed down as a set of events, oral tradition passed down from one generation to another, and maybe those accounts ended up being woven into the narrative given by St. Matthew in the Gospel. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was the other conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, not Jupiter and Venus. Or maybe it was a comet, or maybe it was something else. Determining the astronomical facts, knowing what was in the sky, is not difficult. Calculating what happened 2,000 years ago, as long as you start with enough precision now, knowing exactly where everything is and how things are moving, dialing back the clock 2,000 years is easy. Second-guessing the significance that the Magi or other astrologers would have applied or attributed to the events that were in the sky, that's a different matter. That is essentially just speculation. But of course, the underlying message is still the same. I'd like to wish all of Tweeddale a wonderful Christmas. Thank you very much.